I was not allowed to have visual aids for this talk, so I'm going to have to act out a few things here. Okay, the hanging claw in North Carolina, the pinwheel of death in Maryland, the stake by the lake, it's in Ohio. It's the shrug emoticon for the millennials out there. And earmuffs in Illinois. All right, what are those? Are they band names? They'd be great band names. Are they bars? No, they're not bars. They're all names or nicknames given to congressional districts. And so if you were to see them on a map, you would see, they really resemble these shapes. And so they're districts that have been gerrymandered in one way or another in order to pick up a certain demographic or leave out another demographic. So gerrymandering, redistricting, it's always been controversial. So you probably can all picture in your head the district drawn by Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, the original gerrymander. It's the political cartoon with a salamander on it. So that was actually a state legislative district. People like to think it's congressional, but it was a state legislative district, and that was the first gerrymander that we know of. So, thinking about this is Constitution Camp, what does the Constitution say about districting and redistricting? The Constitution largely leaves it up to the states to run elections. So there's some things that are prescribed, but for the most part, it's left up to the states. So the original Constitution says that there will be a census every 10 years and one seat for every 30,000 people, taking into account the 3/5 compromise. So this number of 30,000 was actually George Washington's idea. It was probably his only contribution to the Constitutional Convention. So he's the presiding officer. He came down from the chair and gave this compromise. The two sides were fighting over the number of representatives we would have in the Congress, and by lowering the amounts, it would increase the numbers and benefit the smaller states. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists, I'm probably being a little loose in my language here and putting these people into camps, but they argued about the districts. The Federalists wanted larger congressional districts. They thought they would be fine. They thought with large districts, only virtuous men would be able to earn office, right? So only the virtuous would earn the votes from all the electorates. The Anti-Federalists said the opposite. They said only the corruptible and the rich could win in a large district. So there's a fight over the size of the districts. There's also a fight over if districts that were far from the capital, how could they be represented, or how would the members know what their constituents want when it was so far away? So there's fights over the size of the districts, the size of the legislature, etc. So after the first census, there was one House seat for about every 33,000 inhabitants, again taking into account the 3/5 compromise, which gives us 105 seats in the initial Congress. These were mostly single-member districts, although over time we've seen various districting procedures used. We've seen at-large. Some states would just do at-large. You get 6 members. We elect everyone from across the state. Some had multi-member districts. Philadelphia was one of the first multi-member districts. I think there were 2 members for a while. And then some had these weird hybrids that would try to combine these different things. So if we were to stick with the original compromise of 30,000, 33,000 seats, I think we would have over 9,000 seats in the Congress today. If any of you have seen the Star Wars movies, this would be the Galactic Senate, where everyone has their own little spaceship they fly around in. So seats were added over time as the population grew, and so districts have increased. So in 1911, they fixed the size of the House to 435 districts. This temporarily increased to 437 when Hawaii and Alaska became states, because they had to give them representation, and then they reduced the size back to 435 afterwards. There's been a recent proposal to increase, although this has died away, to 437 to give Washington, D.C. a voting member of the House of Representatives. My lay reading says that probably is unconstitutional, but one seat would have gone to Washington, D.C., and then as a compromise, they would give a seat to Utah. So Utah had just missed out on a congressional district. Utah argued, we have many people who live in the state, they just happen to be overseas on missions, right? So they're doing very important work. But for 2 years, they're not living in the state. And so I'll come back later to how we sort of count people. That proposal sort of went away. The average size district is a little north of 700,000 people, although there's actually pretty large variation across the country. So they have to be equal within the state, but there's variation across. So Montana has almost 1 million people in their one congressional district, whereas Wyoming has just a little north of 500,000 people in a district. So you have to get at least one, and so this gives us sort of this variation. So again, today 435 districts based on population. After the census, the districts are reapportioned. They're divided up amongst the states. There's a formula for this. You can use different formulas, and the last couple districts might change hands. As you can imagine, Jefferson had a formula that probably favored the southern, larger states. Hamilton had a formula. It favored New York. I don't remember which formula we're using now, but you could change it, and the last couple of districts might bounce around a little bit. Districts must be contiguous. That is, you can't have a pocket of a district over here and a pocket of a district over here. They have to all be one unit. Now, they can be connected by very small pieces of land, but they need to be connected. One time, there was a mistake, possibly a mistake. There's a district in California that was only contiguous during low tide. And I was trying to research and see what happened to this district, but I don't remember the answer. But they said, look, we'll bring the judge out at a certain time of day. Look, it's connected. We're good. So every 10 years, we have a census. The census is an actual numeration, so we have to count people. It turns out it'd actually be more accurate to estimate people rather than count. But the Constitution says it has to be an actual enumeration, so we count. This gives us lots of problems. Undercounts, so these are people we might miss. You can imagine homeless people might be missed. People who perhaps don't want the government to know where they are might be missed. So perhaps a lot of, if you're an undocumented worker, if someone comes to the door and says, I'm here from the government, how many people live here, you might not give a truthful answer. Now, the census doesn't care. They don't care about citizenship, right? They just want to actually count noses. But some people might not want to be counted. There's overcounts, people who are counted multiple times. When I give this lecture to my students, I say, you as students are probably overcounted a lot, right? So imagine the census taker comes to your parents' house and says, how many people live here? And mom or dad says, well, there's myself and my wife, and I have 3 kids, so there's 5. Meanwhile, one of the kids is here. Another kid made a mistake and went to school in Texas, right? And so the census taker also comes to the dorm or the apartment, and they get counted there. So people can be counted multiple times. There's questions about counting prisoners. Should prisoners count in their residence, so to speak, or where they're in prison? I think the way the rule is now, you're counted where you're in prison. In some states in New York, lots of crimes are committed in New York City, but the prisoners are all upstate. And so there's a few, especially state legislative districts in New York, where a lot of the residents can't vote because they're in prison. I read a story, there was a small council ward in, I think, Iowa, with maybe 1,500 people. 1,300 are prisoners. A guy won an office with 3 votes, himself, his wife, and his daughter. So counting prisoners is controversial. And of course, doing the census takes time, so there's births and deaths. Now, the reason why this is important, why it's important to count people correctly, is the courts have ruled in Reynolds v. Sims, and Westbury v. Sanders, and some other cases, that districts have to be as equal as possible. And so the one surefire way to get a district declared unconstitutional or illegal is to say the sizes between the districts within the state are not equal. If someone could draw a plan that was more equal, you would probably win the case. But we know that these numbers are pretty flawed, but we have to pick something. So the 1964 Westbury case gives us the one person, one vote, which we think of as sort of fundamental to American democracy, But it was in '64, that we had this case. Prior to that, we had a lot of differences within states about the size of the districts. So the process, extremely political. In most states, it's done by the state legislature. So it's like passing a bill. The legislature draws districts. The governor will approve the plan. Usually the outcome is either a partisan gerrymander. So when we have unified government, one party controls the process. They draw districts that benefit them. This is perfectly legal. It is a little risky. If you draw a district that is 51%, you think, to your party, it's possible you counted wrong, and you could lose. So it's a little risky. The other outcome is an incumbent protection plan. So usually under divided government, the idea is let's just keep what we have and return all the incumbents to office. Also perfectly legal, but usually you're wasting votes. An alternative way to draw the districts, and this is where some of my research comes in, is to use a commission. Now, commissions come in all shapes and sizes. I think the overarching thing that makes something a commission is the process takes place outside of the legislature. So the governor and the members of the legislature don't have to approve the plan. Although, to make things interesting, there are commissions where they do approve the plan. But the drawing gets done outside. So some are partisan. So you might say each party gets a certain number of people to these commissions. Some are nonpartisan, where if you've held elective office or plan on holding elective office, you can't serve on the commission. New Jersey used to have a commission that was partisan, but the tiebreaker was a political scientist. So of course, this is my favorite type of commission. And there's other sort of flavors of this. Commissions use different criteria to draw districts. So they have to be equal in population. But after that, they can use different things they think are important. Iowa has a commission where they don't take into account where the current incumbent members live. It's not part of the information they use. So they draw the districts without the information. And you have lots of times where incumbents will be drawn in together and either forced to move or run against another incumbent. They can keep communities of interest intact, or they could decide not to keep communities of interest intact. So they can pick their own criteria. So my research says if you use commissions, you're more likely to get competitive districts. Now, this isn't true everywhere, but generally it is. Now, some states it's hard to draw competitive districts. I think like a state like Oklahoma, you could draw one, maybe two competitive districts, but some I think are going to be very one-sided, just looking at the way the state is drawn up. So real quick, I'll talk about, does redistricting cause polarization? This is a pretty hot topic. So the story goes, we have a state, we have people draw the lines, they draw, let's put a whole bunch of Democrats in this one district, a whole bunch of Republicans in this other district. They're all very safe members, and they're going to be only beholden to their party, only beholden to the people who maybe vote in a primary election. So that's a good story, right? And then we end up with a very polarized House of Representatives. Political scientists say, look, it's a good story, but it probably doesn't hold. So one reason they give is look at the Senate. The Senate is also a very polarized body, right? There's no redistricting in the Senate. And so redistricting can't be the major driving force behind polarization because we have another body that's polarized that is not redistricted. So the story political scientists like to say is, what we get from the House is Democrats tend to live together, usually in cities, right? So you have a lot of Democrats who live in a fairly compact area, and Republicans live more or less everywhere else. So sort of a natural drawing of districts, you end up with districts that are sort of fairly Democratic, and then the rest end up being fairly Republican. Now you could draw districts. You could, for example, let's go back to New York again. You could somehow slice and dice New York City, which is very liberal, with some areas of upstate New York, and try to get liberal district or competitive districts. But this would take some doing. So they would argue, political scientists argue, that it's the general sort of where people live and demographic sorting that contributes to these polarized districts, and not necessarily the redistricting process. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll take questions.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.